Every vehicle or piece of tech you've ever seen or owned started life as a blueprint on someone's desk or computer. From there, they became prototypes, and if they're proven to be good ideas, only then will they become finished products. Many vehicles fall between the lines, though, and some others only enter production for a short run. Most of the world has forgotten about them, but we haven't, and this video is a celebration of our favorite old vehicles and forgotten ideas. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, USA, is one of America's most iconic and recognizable pieces of architecture. It feels like it's been around forever, but it's actually still less than 100 years old, and it nearly looked very different. Had designer Cleve F. Schaffer had his way, it wouldn't have been a bridge at all. It would have been a tunnel. His bold vision called for the road to go below the water of San Francisco Bay, allowing boats to pass above it. It would have been the Golden Gate Boat Tunnel, not the Golden Gate Bridge. Assuming that all of Schaffer's costings were correct, it would cost less than a third of the final price of the bridge that stands today, and would also have been safer to people and traffic. The reason for the rejection of his plan, which he submitted in 1932, being rejected is unknown. The most popular theory is that the declaration required for vehicles to safely embark upon his ramps and enter the tunnels might have caused gridlock in San Francisco. The Gulfstream Peregrine was a good-looking, fast-moving business jet invented during the 1980s. People wanted to buy it, and based on the usual life expectancy of such a plane, there should still be some in the air today. That isn't the case. Instead, only one unit was ever built in 1982, and then the whole Gulfstream jet project was canceled. The aircraft, developed by Gulfstream Aerospace, was supposed to be the next step forward in the evolution of planes from the company's Hustler and Peregrine 600 stock. It used the Hustler's forward fuselage paired with the wings and tail of the Peregrine 600, and completed a successful test flight in January 1983. The test flight satisfied buyers, and orders were placed, with deposits paid. The issue that stopped it moving forward was a regulatory one. At the time of the plane's invention, the maximum stalling speed of a single-engine aircraft was 61 knots, and Gulfstream Aerospace couldn't find a way to make the new Peregrine comply with it. They had to ditch the concept in 1985 and hand back the deposits. Annoyingly, the rule that grounded the plane was rescinded a few years later. Our next curious piece of old vehicle tech looks like an enormous ale barrel, but we should give it more respect than that. It's actually thought to be the first military submarine in world history, and it was designed by Yefim Nikonov, a Russian carpenter, in 1718. Yefim wrote directly to Peter the Great to tell him that he'd built a secret vessel capable of sailing below the water and attacking enemy ships with cannons, and he got the Tsar's attention. The carpenter was summoned to St. Petersburg and asked to build a scale model. When he did this successfully, the enthusiastic Tsar asked Yefim to build a full-size battleship version of the wooden submarine. It looks primitive, but it includes a fully functional airlock and flamethrowers that fire through tubes poking out of the water. Unfortunately, the battleship-sized version of the submarine sank in 1724 during testing. Subsequent retrials in 1725 and 1727 didn't go any better, and poor Yefim was eventually charged with wasting public money and sent to go and work at a shipyard on the Volga River as punishment. Most people believe that the Concorde, a plane designed by the French working in partnership with the British, was the world's first supersonic plane. It wasn't. That honor goes to the Soviet aircraft known as the Tupolev Tu-144, which beat the Concorde in the act of breaking the sound barrier by 4 months. Unfortunately, it didn't offer the same luxurious standards inside. Concorde offered comfortable seats, 5-star meals, and plenty of pampering to its passengers. Inside the Tu-144, there was said to be so much engine noise that it was impossible to have a conversation with the people sat close to you. The fuselage of the Tu-144 was prone to cracking and warping, and a high-profile crash at the Paris Air Show in 1973 trashed the plane's reputation internationally. Only 102 commercial flights were conducted between 1968 and 1983, which is when the plane was officially retired. And of those, only 55 carried passengers. It was still a history-making aircraft, though, and even in retirement, it still found a purpose. A Tu-144 was later used by Soviet cosmonauts for Buran training, and then by NASA as a supersonic research vehicle. The last time one took to the air was 1999. A few years ago, the transit elevated bus was touted as the solution to traffic buildup in densely populated areas like Beijing in China. The premise of the idea was that a bus body would be placed on tracks either side of the road and glide above the traffic, giving space to anything passing below it in the hollow base of its body. It was also known as the tunnel or straddling bus. The Chinese authorities initially loved the idea and authorized trials to begin in Beijing in 2010. 2010 came and went, though, and the technology wasn't ready. Although the bus could travel in straight lines, turning corners without cutting up traffic was extremely difficult. No progress had been made by 2016, and a further prototype trial in August of that year produced such bad results that the project appeared to have moved backward. Funding for the project was then withdrawn by all major investors, and the one prototype bus body that's known to exist is currently gathering dust in a rusty barn. More than 30 people involved in the project went on to be charged with fraud in 2017, accused of taking deposits and soliciting investments for a project that they knew they couldn't deliver. There are many ways to get rid of an old, unwanted train, and most of them involve the total destruction of the train itself. That's why we are always pleased to see more creative solutions like the Train to Heaven sculpture in Wrocław, Poland. This unusual piece of public art features a train glued to the tracks and seemingly aimed straight at the skies like a space rocket. It's been standing in its current position since 2010, but the story of the train goes back much further than that. It was built in 1944 as a TY2 steam locomotive and didn't look quite as steampunk as it does today. Aside from being a beautiful sculpture, the piece is an attempt to rehabilitate the reputation of the TY2 engine. They were used extensively by the Nazis during the Second World War and were nicknamed Kriegslokomotiven, or war locomotives, but were taken back by the Polish and used on the state railways for civilian duties after the war ended. Only 54 of them still exist today, but this unit, registered as TY2 1035, is the most famous of them all. When you hear the brand name Skoda, you probably associate it with low-cost cars. You almost certainly wouldn't associate it with trains. And even if you were aware that the company made locomotives, you won't have heard of this next one. There's a reason for that. It's a gas turbine locomotive, and its development was top secret. The need for what would effectively be a jet train was underlined when a project to electrify the railways of Czechoslovakia ground to a halt during the 1950s due to insufficient power and copper shortages. Noted Soviet scientist Vladimir Vasilyevich Uvarov was put in charge of the project, and by 1958, he had a prototype. The cutting-edge vehicle was shown off to the world at the Expo 58 exhibition in Brussels that year, but the engine was swapped for a steam turbine, so as not to reveal Soviet secrets to potentially unfriendly nations. By December of that year, the gas turbine was back inside and trials began. The engine set a record by dragging a train weighing 6,500 tons in May 1959, but caught fire and burned down 3 months later. A second prototype was built but suffered from numerous design and performance issues, and was eventually retired from service in 1966 after just 4 years. It was then scrapped. Looking at the sheer size of the Kalinin K7, it's amazing that it ever took to the sky at all. This behemoth might be better described as a flying fortress than a plane. Almost everything about the design of the aircraft, built in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, flies in the face of typical plane design. The wings were over 7 feet thick and contained all of the passenger seats. The machine gun turrets and landing gear were below the wings. The Soviet team who designed it wanted it to be capable of passenger flight and also heavy bombing raids. And based on its appearance, they might have wanted it to do both at the same time. It took 8 engines just to get it off the ground, and prior to the invention of the jet, it was the biggest plane ever made. While the first few test flights in August 1933 were listed as successful, there were known issues with vibration and stability in the air, and any attempt to solve the problems only seemed to make them worse. A series of modifications before the 7th test flight weakened the tail boom, which then suffered a structural failure while in the air and led to a crash. The K-7 project was written off immediately. If you know where to look in France, you'll find the graffiti-tagged remains of the SK, a people mover service that never moved a single person. It was supposed to function as a cable car of the kind that's proven to be popular and successful in Shanghai. But Paris isn't Shanghai. The SK, named for the transport company Seoul and associated inventor Jan de Kermadec, was conceived during the 1980s as a way of revolutionizing public transport in Paris and replacing the defunct Belleville tramway. The company has had success with the vehicles in Canada with the idea, and even elsewhere in France, but it didn't work out in Paris. 3 SK cable lines were built around the French capital at huge expense to the French taxpayer, but none of them were ever used. The problems around Charles de Gaulle Airport ought to have condemned the whole project. The SK units couldn't handle the sharp bends required of them and also struggled across long distances. The plan to open the service to the public was pushed back from its original date of 1996 and then abandoned entirely in 1999. A new transport system had to be installed in its place, and the cost of installing and then removing all of the SK infrastructures came in at almost $500 million. Initially, the company had quoted the French authorities a price of just $70 million for the whole system. No matter where you go in the world, you won't find any vehicle like Richard Scaldwell's JAP V8-powered GN cycle car, modeled on the classic British cycle cars that were made in London, England during the early years of the 20th century. You'd struggle to find an original version of the automobile today because of its age and low production numbers. But Richard Scaldwell has built his from spare parts, using the base of an antique belt-driven GN V-twin as a foundation. The air-cooled V8 GAP engine is the most remarkable part of the vehicle. It's an original working piece from 1908 that was intended for use in the planes of the era, and is one of only 4 that's known to have survived into the 21st century. The whole car weighs just 1,039 pounds, which we're told makes it an incredibly light, agile drive, albeit one that feels and behaves more like a motorcycle than a car. Richard first completed his GN cycle car tribute in the 1990s, but back then it still had open auxiliary exhaust ports that belched smoke, oil, and flame. He's since closed them off with copper bands and fitted a period-appropriate oil pump to make driving a little less dirty, and a whole lot safer for the people behind him. It takes quite a feat of imagination to look at the state of the MV Kalakala today and see it as the luxurious first-class ferry that it used to be. To be fair to the battered wreck, it's been around for a long time. It launched in 1935 and spent 30 years on ferry duty before sailing for pastures new in Seattle, where it became one of the best-known and most visited tourist attractions in the whole city. She owes her distinctive Art Deco design to Louis Proctor, who would later go on to become famous for designing planes for Boeing. Aboard the MV Kalakala, guests would find a dance hall complete with a full-sized orchestra. By 1930s and 1940s standards, that was like having a floating nightclub. As beautiful as Proctor's design was, though, it lacked practicality. Poor engine alignment meant the ship constantly vibrated while moving, causing structural damage in the process and necessitating expensive repairs every few years. By the 1970s, she'd started to cost more than she was making, and so she was sold to new owners who wanted to use her hull as a shrimp processing unit. That business was short-lived, and the MV Kalakala spent the next 40 years being sold from one neglectful owner to another, before eventually being earmarked for scrapping in 2015. Maurice A. Julian designed many a fine car during his time on this earth, but one of his most experimental and intriguing was the 1947 Julian M5 2CV. This was the Citroën designer's vision for the future of personal transport in the optimistic years that immediately followed the end of the Second World War. It was mostly overlooked during its era and isn't even all that well known now. But the development of this car led to the filing of many patents for ideas that we take for granted today, including the group fixing of the engine, gearbox, and axle. Not many units of the car were produced in the first place, and it's possible that this red variant is the only one that's still around today. It survived largely because it was swept up into a private collection for many years and kept in a showroom. But even that level of comfort didn't stop it from losing its windows and hood at some point over the passing of the decades. The original 310cc 4-stroke single-cylinder engine still runs, though, and that probably means it still has at least some value to a collector or classic car enthusiast. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.